There are many misconceptions about women's power in medieval Europe. People often default to the assumption that women had little power, but this is simply not true. Medieval Spain, specifically in Leon Castile, is very unique for its treatment of royal daughters. The royal daughters were more than just princesses. These so-called infanta had special roles within the royal family and were integral to the development of the region of Leon Castile as a whole. Now, today, scholars have debated how much power infantas have actually had, and more specifically, what sectors their power resides in. It appears that the primary location of their power will change over time, where religious reforms and political volatility will relegate the positions of these women. Much of this work can best be viewed through charters, diplomas, donations, and other legal documentation, but also through chronicles. And while the chronicle sources from medieval Spain are famously sparse, these chronicles are not afraid to recognize the power that these women had, which makes them very unique and special. Additionally, one of the most important diplomas that will be discussed this is Urraca of Zamora's diploma to the Sea of Toy. It's a very important one. And so, by investigating a couple of these sources and the work done by these historians of the period, we can see one of the most powerful examples of women's political, social, and ecclesiastical power present in medieval history, or at least this period of medieval history. And so, in this episode, first we are going to discuss what exactly is an infanta, how are our scholars defining these women. Secondly, we're going to expand our focus to look at their land holdings, the infantazgo, which is just the collection of land that the women had. And then third, finally, we will look at a couple examples of infanta and answer how did these women exercise their authority and how does that authority change over time. And after answering these questions, we will then kind of decide how did they control their power, specifically Urraca Zamora. She's important to this podcast. And so, to further discuss these women, we need to clearly define what the infanta are. And so infanta is just another name for the royal daughters of the ruling line, specifically those who are not next in line for the throne. Now, specifically, they are also virgin daughters who live a religious life and support their male relatives' rule through the church. And the term infanta did directly translate to princess, but these women are special. They are more than regular princesses, which is why we do not translate the term. It's not quite the same thing. And there is some argument among scholars that debates the category that make an infanta. There were some infanta that were married and widowed, some who were not virgins, some had children, and there's some variety there in the infantas and their categories. Now, there's some scholars, the more traditional, would say that this disqualifies women from the office of infanta having children or being married. But more modern scholars do not view the definition of this category, do not view this category so strictly, and they argue the most important thing is the royal birth and the power position that accompanies it. So at the end of the day, the royal birth is what matters the most. And these women had power that were not afraid to exercise that power. All authors that I've read, whether older, from the late 20th century or from now the early 21st century, they are not afraid to highlight infanta as co-signers of charters, advisors to their male relatives. They are council members to their male relatives, and they even create their own councils to support their own individual rule over their church holdings. And they were overall valued members of the monarchy, even from Collins, one of the oldest scholars I've looked at. He wrote in the 1970s. He agrees on this point as well. Additionally, most of these scholars also, with the exception of probably Collins, do not exceptionalize these women when looking at the charters. There's nothing to set them apart from each other on an exceptionality scale. They are not manly women. They are exercising their role as it is designed to be. And now, modern scholarship views the monarchy as a family unit, which a group position where each family member has their role, and this would fit into the definition of an infanta very well. Infanta is one part of that monarchy role, specifically in the religious sphere. And so there's a balance to ruling. Each person has a role to play in the governing of the kingdom. Royal daughters play a very significant role in this system, and this can very heavily be supported and seen through analysis of Infantas and their power. Um, so, zooming out quickly, let's talk about where the tradition of Infantas originate from, because not only do I think the story is interesting, I do think it's important to our understanding. And so, having monastic royals is not something unique to just Leon and Castile. However, in other regions of medieval Europe, these royal offspring were comparable to abbots and abbesses, more so than infantas, just simply meaning that they didn't quite have the same um, spiritual position that these women had, and we'll talk about their spiritual position later on. One of the things that makes infantas so special is the notion that their relationship is more than just to the physical church. It is spiritual, said to be with Christ himself. So that's kind of what one of the things that makes these women exceptional in the realm of medieval Europe as a whole. So Lucy Pick, in her book, Her Father's Daughters, outlines the development of this history very, very, very well. And that book is going to be the foundational source for this podcast, and I recommend everybody to go read it because it's amazing. Um, and in her analysis, Pick traces the practice of infantas, or the practice of consecrating royal daughters to monastic lives, back to the Visigothic Austrians who came to Spain into the early 7th and 8th centuries, um, with the first Asturian kingdom founded by Pelayo. And so the Asturians were the first to consecrate their royal daughters to religious, chaste lives, at least in Spain. And another thing that makes these Asturians so unique is that under their rule, the king has sacred power because of the office that he held, not because of the family that he was born into. So the Asturians had an elected monarchy, and the royal family was only special because of the office that they were elected into. That's the reason that they had all their power, and the power could easily be taken away by the Asturian nobles and those who vote for the Asturian kings. And so there's pressure on these people to perform and kind of do have goodwill with the kingdom and do good things for the people. Um, and also it left little space for these royal daughters. They could not claim authority on the basis of their birth alone. They had to prove that they were worthy of this rule, and that's part of where the practice of infantas is birthed out of. And the first infanta is named Adesina, and she was the first daughter of Asturians to be consecrated as an infanta. And at the time, it was done primarily to protect the royal family from outside marriages infringing on their power as sole rulers. Additionally, it was a way for royal daughters to gain favor and display authority amongst the public. Through monastic work, charity, and donations, the Infanta were able to foster popular support for rule, which would have been key for Asturians in an elective monarchy. And so the whole background story of the Asturians and Adesina and how the elective monarchy drove the creation of this institution is all very interesting and all very complex. But I do not want to hang up on it here too long, because I do want to specifically talk about the Infantas of like the 12th century. Um, and so we can't explore all of that history today, but to very briefly sum it up, the Asturian kings placed their royal daughters into monasteries, mainly to protect their own rule. This trend continued throughout the 11th, 12th, into the 13th centuries, being inherited by the kings of Leon and Castile, also people ruling in Spain, along with other Iberian kingdoms. Royal daughters had a lot of power, and these families needed a protected way for them to exercise that power, and that's kind of what it comes down to. It is a way for a vector of power for these women. And then, additionally, in the Iberian sphere, something that makes the royalty unique is that the crown passes through the women of the royal line. So this means that the daughter of the king was next in line for the throne, not the sons, unless the king obviously had no daughters. So this would become problematic for these kings who've only had daughters, especially only one daughter. So, because when this daughter gets married to another noble, presumably a lesser noble, because you're the princess of the kingdom, you are the highest royal. Um, she elevates her status to that. She elevates his status, her new husband's status to that of kingship, which simultaneously decreases the power held by her and her original loyal family. And so this is something that lesser branches of the royal line are often looking for opportunities to advance their own position. Marriage is a common way for them to do that, specifically in this kind of way of marrying royal daughters. And so the Leonese kings are basically trying to say, I'm not giving up any of my power. Like, I'm going to, if I need to protect my daughters and keep them religious, chaste, and unmarried to protect my power, that's what I'm going to do. They were selfish. They wanted the power they inherited, and so they kept their daughters, who are the main vectors of that power, isolated to this religious life. And that's not to say that this was all male-centered king ruling. A lot of the women came down to accept the system and manipulate it in their own way. But now let's bring it back forward, talking about the Infantas of the 12th century. And so, as time progresses into the 12th century in Spain, the role of the Infanta will shift to accommodate the needs of the ruling family. And so, the model examples of what an Infanta was always meant to be can be found in the examples of Urraca Zamora and Sandra Ramirez, the sister and the granddaughter of King Alfonso VI of Leon. And then we can also look at Urraca's sister, Elvira Ramirez. She is also another example of a model infanta, specifically when it comes to the infantazgo land holdings. And so there are differing arguments among scholars for how the infantas exercised their power. Was it due mostly to the land holdings of the infantazgo, which gave these women's land, riches, and use disposably to meet their goals? Or was the power more executed through network building these women were able to create? The religious connections, the political connections that the position allowed them to create. And so these questions have been posed by scholars in the field and have been answered by scholars in the field to hopefully help contribute to our understanding of what the infantas are as a whole. And so how have scholars interpreted these couple of questions? And so earlier scholars, like Collins from the 1970s, who I've talked about before, along with other more early 20th century scholars, were still uncovering the early findings of medieval history at this point. In this period, historians had a hard time centering women in the documents. They often were centering the men, mostly because charter sources, which are some of the most significant in our analysis of the Infanta and women's history in general, these charters show us the most in power being executed by these women. They, at this point in the 1970s, they were not being analyzed by historians in the proper context. And so Collins is going to specifically draw on the Historia Silence and other chronicles to draw many of his conclusions on these women. And while his analysis is pretty progressive for the time, and he does not entirely dismiss women's role in administration, he mentions Elvira Ramirez co-signing documents, advisory on council, all of these things. He does relegate infantas to the position of abbesses, just citing them as royal abbesses, similar to the way that some princesses in like England or France would be considered abbots or just abbesses, not abbots. And this is not true, and it kind of really reduces the position of these women. Infantas were a little bit more than that. Not to diss the royal abbesses out there, but the infantas were different, and that's something that a lot of early scholars are going to miss. But there was no doubt that Urraca and Elvira had power, and the Historia Silence mentions that specifically Urraca is going to reign after the death of her brother Alfonso VI, and specifically it discusses the favor that Urraca showed towards Alfonso compared to her other brothers, which is going to help Alfonso take the throne. So Urraca's power is going to help Alfonso take the throne. However, this favor spawns a rumor of an incestuous relationship between Alfonso and Urraca. However, there's not really much merit to that claim, and the a lot of the claims are kind of not very good to support that, and it's really seen more as like a mother-son kind of nurturing relationship as opposed to like incestuous, like kind of something like that. But Urraca was still able to support her rule through her relationship to Christ, reflecting her purity as an infanta, kind of helping dispel those rumors, and scholars kind of agree with that. Another important characteristic about the Infanta was that they were spiritually married to Christ himself, which I've mentioned a few times now. And they were dedicating, the Infanta dedicated themselves to his work, Christ's work on earth. And this is kind of what makes them really special and unique. The Historia Silence directly mentions this relationship, but it can also be seen in charter sources as well through analysis of donations and documentation and the language that these women are using. Um, Lucy Pick, in her work, also discusses the symbolic relationship that these women have to Christ, and that this was not simply Abba's work for these women. This was a functioning relationship between the women, Christ, and the kingdom. So this was like a next level spiritual connection that people everywhere are not going to be able to reach. Um, and so now more modern scholars like Lucy Pick and Gianna Bianchini, both of these women, recognize the significance that the Infantas played during the 11th and 12th century ruling families' decisions. Bianchini analyzes these women primarily through their land holdings, which is called the Infantazgo, which I've also mentioned a few times, but now we're going to dive deeper into. And she claims that this is where most of their power stems from. Bianchini is going to analyze a period slightly later than Lucy Pick, going into the reign of Alfonso VIII, whereas Pick stops at Alfonso VI. I think she might talk a little bit about Alfonso VII, but Bianchini's going to go into the 13th century, where Pick stops at the 12th. And so this may explain why Pick is more focused on the network building that Urraca was able to do, the religious connection she was able to make, whereas Bianchini is more focused on the land holdings and the riches that these women had access to. But before we discuss Bianchini's works, we want to define what the Infantazgo is and how does it contribute to these women's power. So I'm going to keep this part very brief, so we don't run out of time. But the Infantazgo was simply the name for the collection of land holdings, mostly monastery and churches, that were controlled by the Infantas. And these were controlled by the Infantas as a collective. It was not owned by one singular Infanta. If there was more than one, they split the land holdings in different ways, not equally even, just in different ways, whichever ways made the most sense at the time. And so many debates have surrounded the institution of the Infantazgo, and some claim that these land holdings were given to the Infantas by the king, implying that the king is the sole ruler of this power. But this analysis is problematic because it takes power away from the women in this scenario, which is where we know the power really lies, and it implies that the king delegates them their power. In reality, Bianchini explains that while many of these land holdings were bestowed upon Infantas by the king, it was typically at the consent of the previous Infanta. And additionally, none of the Infanta ever held all the Infantazgo at once, like I said before. So they were very tactical and calculated about who was owning what and for what reasons. Nothing was done without a reason. And so while it may appear that the male kings are the ones in charge, these powerful properties of the Infanta simply use the kings. They use the kings as a vector of their power, as a claim to legitimacy. They pass their lands through the king to other Infantas because they can't simply just pass it from one to the next. But the most important thing to remember about the Infantazgo is that it was the Infantas who were the one in control of the land, not the kings. They had the final say about where it went, if it was donated, who ruled it, all of these things. And we know this because on all diplomas and charters concerning Infantazgo properties, the Infanta name is always listed first, even before the name of the king. And so that really shows the power that these women, the sole power these women had over these properties. So let's look at now Urraca Zamora, who has already been mentioned. She's given her title retroactively in the 13th century due to her role in governing the kingdom, or not the kingdom, but the duchy, I guess it would be considered, of Zamora. So now I'm just going to call her Urraca because Urraca of Zamora is very long and very annoying to say. And so she does a very good job representing the religious power of women at the time and what they were able to do. She was born in 1033. She held power all the way to her death in 1101. And her religious contributions and network creation heavily advised the ruler of the Kingdom of Leon, Alfonso VI. Additionally, Urraca's niece, Sancha Ramirez, is considered by authors Cavero and Bianchini to be the premier example of what an infanta was used what an infanta in the execution of her power looks like, and she's going to use the infantazgo properties as a political tool, and as a way of to build relationships between herself and other political factors. But I don't want to stray away from Uraka too far, so we're going to come back, talk about Uraka, her relationship building, her network building in the ecclesiastical sphere, specifically with the Sea of Toy. And so the Sea of Toy is not actually a sea or an ocean here. Sea, S-E-E, is in the religious context, which refers to the position of authority of a church or religious organization. So simply, Uraka is trying to reestablish the church in Toy, which is important because Toy is land originally donated by Uraka's grandfather on the border of what is now modern day Portugal and northwestern Spain. And it was ruled by Uraka's brother Garcia after the kingdoms were split between Uraka's three brothers. And Garcia was kind of unable to restore the Sea of Toy. And he was the king of Galicia when he tried to do that, the king of the kingdom that Toy is in. And he was still unable to do that. And so Uraka is going to restore this sea and using her infanta status, which I think is going to be very significant. And the way that she does this is she mirrors the original diploma made by her grandfather, Alfonso V. This is going to give her more legitimacy and power in her issuing of the documents. And so, but mainly in her actions to restore the sea, Uraka was able to collect the signatures of many nobles, abbots, church officials, and even lesser royals throughout the Leonese Castilian kingdom to support the restoration of the sea. She was able to collect all these signatures, not necessarily because she was a princess, but because of the connections that she had. And this is significant, I think, specifically above the abbots and the church officials. The connection that she has to the church really helps her in those areas. And Uraka is going to center her religious authority in Toy around the sea, donating the and through the donation of property and through ecclesiastical support, she connects herself to the local women. She leaves her influence in a place of strategic importance. She also by giving the sea huge sums of her property, her infantazgo holdings, she's going to help prop up this institution and help them kind of get back on their feet, but also kind of be seen as the patron, giving her a lot more credibility in this area of the kingdom, which is kind of a volatile area on a borderland far away from the center of the kingdom. So this is going to kind of help her brothers who are ruling the kingdom kind of cement their rule. And so the two main actions that stick out to me here about Uraka and the Sea of Toy is that Uraka was a beneficiary to many monasteries throughout her kingdom, but she was very strategic with her implementation. The work that she does in Toy, additionally, the donation of the chalice, we can look at Don Uraka's chalice, which is in San Isidoro, which is in Leon, a little bit different. But these show her dedication not only to the church, but to the kingdom and to the stability of the kingdom as a whole. And this also reinforces her royal authority amongst the church and amongst common people. But ultimately, her restoration of the sea allows her kind of to flex her connections and power that she has as her status as her at her position as an infanta. She uses the vast amount of property that she's delegated, along with monasteries, as a vector of propping up the sea. She basically just kind of allows it to exist because she uses her power to. She just has so much power. She's able to completely do something that even the king of Galicia couldn't even do. And so I really think that that's amazing. Next, let's look at quickly Sancho Ramirez, who is going to come later from 1059 to 11. She born in 1059, died. Born in 1059, but died in 1159. The great niece of Uraka of Zamora through her mother is Sancha. She's another infanta that exercises her power willingly. However, a lot of authors argue it from a different angle compared to Uraka, and so one of the authors, Georgia Cavero, has an article from 2013 that is dedicated to the study of the infantazgo and argues that the center of Sancha's power this is going to be later on, can be then Uraka, but Sancha's power can be found from her infantazgo properties, and they're going to serve as economic support for a lot of the women or the infanta that owned them. Sancha participates in the marrying of other royal daughters into other royal kingdoms, specifically Galicia, supporting their rule there, helping bring it into the greater, what will be Leonese kingdom. She contributes to their dowries with her infantasgo properties to help create this political support. Cavero also uses primarily the diploma collection of Sancho to support the claims here, which includes many chronicle works like the Historica Solens, the Chronicle of Alfonso VII, and some other chronicle works, most all from Lucas of Toy. But Cavero also traces the historiography of Sancho all the way back to the monks of San Isidoro, who are going to be the people dedicated to writing about her, and they're going to be writing about her in a very good light. These monks, they have a very good opinion about the Infantas. And she's always been considered a patron there. And Sancha, she's always considered somebody that has great power, which can be reflected in the way she is written in documents. Gianna Bianchini also calls Sancha the poster child, quote, for discovering the power of the Infantasgo. She discusses the wars between Leon and Castile in the period leading up to the unity between the two kingdoms, and Bianchini argues that this war could ultimately have been started due to the value of Infantasgo properties located between the two kingdoms. And so, with the Infantas being the ones in charge of these properties, they're going to be a key part of the unity of the kingdom. But the Infantasgo primarily is used as a tool to reconcile relationships between the two kingdoms and bring them together. But previously, these properties were not really seen as such a big deal. But we know that now a lot of the Infantas, specifically Sancha Ramirez, was going to use these properties to help her improve her royal power. And so now we know what an infanta is. It's a royal daughter with a relationship to Christ. And we've looked at the examples of Sancha and Urraca, how they're using their infantasgo properties along with their ecclesiastical and political connections. And we can now answer the bigger question scholars have proposed. How does this decline and how does it change over time? We can come to the conclusion that volatility in the region and the period were the leading causes of the evolution of the Infanta. Many scholars of the works I've looked at are going to see that Urraca Zamora and Sancho Ramirez were able to use their status as the Infantas to aid the rule of their monarchy, either by consolidation, the prop up of religious institutions, any of those kinds of things. And so we can say that earlier Infantas like Urraca used most of their power in the religious sphere. The networks they were able to create helped to serve the political, social, and religious needs of the Leonese kingdom. So Urraca is going to be the main example there. And opposingly, Sancha, an Infanta from 2 generations later than Urraca, is going to exercise the majority of her power through her land holdings or the Infantasgo properties that Infantas had sole control over. These properties were desirable to other kingdoms, and they were used to preserve peace, resolve conflicts, and expand networks from a political perspective. Well, we didn't have much time to talk about that. We can see how the uniting of the kingdom of Leon and Castile basically started over disputes between Infantasgo properties. But we can basically say that as time went on, the institution of the Infanta did change, and scholars do all agree upon this. Many scholars highlight that, but that the institution changes, they argue at different periods and different points. And the question is still very much up for debate as historians are uncovering new sources and new ways to analyze these sources every single year. So while I cannot say whether the power of these women truly died out or why it eventually did, what I can say is that scholars all do agree that there was an evolution of the institution of infantas over time, mostly due to changing political factors, threats of invasion, or religious needs. And it seems fair to say that the power of these women did not necessarily decline during the period that I've analyzed, the 11th, 12th, into the 13th century, not just about, but rather their power adapted to the current needs of the royal family until it was no longer deemed necessary or beneficial practice to have it all. And the historical question of Infanta's power will continue to be a debate for many years, I'm sure. We uncover more sources every single day, every single year, and I look forward to seeing what exactly the field proposes next for why these women's power did actually decline. And so lastly, if you have any interest on this topic all go read Lucy Pick's book, Her Father's Daughters. It is a very, 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 very good book. It is the foundational work for this podcast. I would not have been able to do this if I did not read that book. It explains everything that I've tried to explain here better than I ever could. And so, with that being said, I would like to thank you all for listening. I'd like to thank you all for a great semester of learning, and I wish you all a good one. Goodbye.